"You're just a toy soldier," the cadet sneered at the motionless guard. "Nothing but a parade prop." The crowd laughed as the young officer continued his taunts, completely unaware of what lay hidden beneath the guard's pristine uniform. But when Lieutenant General Redford stepped forward and noticed a small piece of fabric poking out from the guard's glove, everything changed. "Where did you come by that marking?" the general asked quietly. One small strip of fabric and everything changed. If you're hooked and want to know what happens next, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more gripping stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales travel. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as foreign military cadets gathered near the ceremonial guard post, their voices growing bolder with each passing moment. Lieutenant Blake Halverson stood at the center of the group, his voice cutting through the warm air as he gestured toward the motionless figure in red. What had started as casual observation during their diplomatic visit was quickly turning into something far less respectful. "Look at him standing there like a statue," Blake said, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "Bet he hasn't moved a muscle in hours. These ceremonial guards are nothing but living mannequins." His fellow cadets chuckled as they formed a loose circle around the rope barrier that separated them from Corporal Ellis Ward's post. The guard remained perfectly still, his bearskin hat casting a shadow over his face, rifle held at the precise angle that regulations demanded. At 38, Ward was older than most of the guards around him, his steady breathing the kind that came from years of discipline forged in places far from palace courtyards. A faint scar, barely visible at his collar, hinted at service these young officers had never seen. Blake's confidence grew with his audience as tourists began to notice the confrontation developing. "I heard they're not even allowed to speak," Blake continued, his voice rising. "Just stand there and look pretty for the cameras. Real soldiers are out there doing actual work while this one plays dress up?" The German cadet beside him nodded in agreement, adding his own commentary about how his country's military focused on substance over ceremony. The French cadet joined in with a theatrical wave of his hand. "Perhaps we should test his discipline," he suggested with a smirk. "See if we can get some reaction from our toy soldier here." Blake's eyes lit up at the suggestion. He stepped closer to the rope barrier, studying Ward's face for any sign of response to their increasingly bold comments. Ward's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his jaw set in the disciplined expression that hours of training had made second nature. The insults washed over him like water off stone, but the crowd was growing larger as word spread about the confrontation. Some tourists pulled out their phones while others looked uncomfortable with the treatment the guard was receiving, though none spoke up to intervene. "Come on then," Blake called out, his voice now carrying across the courtyard. "Give us a smile, parade prop. Show us you're actually alive in there." The German cadet laughed and made an exaggerated salute in Ward's direction. "Maybe he's broken," he added. "Someone should wind him up again." Their laughter echoed off the palace walls as more cadets joined the circle. Blake fed off the attention, his comments becoming more cutting with each passing minute. "I bet this is the hardest thing he's ever done," he declared. "Standing still and looking important. Must be exhausting work." Ward's breathing remained steady and controlled, his grip on his rifle unchanged despite the growing harassment. His eyes never wavered from their fixed point ahead, even as the insults continued to rain down around him. The French cadet stepped forward with renewed enthusiasm. "Perhaps we should report him for poor posture," he suggested mockingly. "Or maybe for failing to acknowledge superior officers." Blake grinned at the suggestion, clearly enjoying his role as ringleader of what he saw as harmless fun at the expense of someone who couldn't fight back. The scene reached a crescendo of arrogance and disrespect as Blake prepared to deliver what he thought would be the final humiliation of the ceremonial guard. But as Blake leaned closer to the rope barrier, his sharp eyes caught something that shouldn't have been there. Blake's eyes narrowed as he spotted the irregularity that would give him the perfect ammunition for his final assault. There, beneath Ward's pristine white glove, was a small strip of dark green fabric, frayed at the edges and barely visible at the wrist. The discovery sent a surge of satisfaction through Blake as he realized he'd found concrete evidence of what he saw as the guards' unprofessional conduct. "Well, well, well," Blake announced loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard as he pointed directly at Ward's left hand. "Look what we have here! Our perfect toy soldier isn't so perfect after all!" The crowd pressed forward eagerly as Blake made his discovery known, their phones immediately focusing on the spot he indicated. The strip of fabric was clearly worn and weathered, its frayed edges standing in stark contrast to the immaculate condition of everything else about Ward's ceremonial dress. The German cadet squinted to get a better look at the forbidden detail. "Is that some kind of decoration?" he asked with obvious disdain. "Whatever it is, it certainly doesn't belong on a proper military uniform." The French cadet nodded in agreement, his earlier theatrical gestures replaced by genuine interest in what appeared to be a serious breach of protocol. Blake stepped closer to the rope barrier, his voice rising with each word. "This is what passes for military precision these days," he declared to the growing crowd. "Can't even follow basic uniform regulations while standing perfectly still?" The crowd murmured their agreement as cameras captured every angle of the mysterious dark green fabric. Blake gestured dramatically at the offending strip, playing to his audience like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Ward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his disciplined composure since the harassment had begun. His breathing remained steady and controlled, but something about Blake's focus on the hidden fabric had triggered a response that hours of insults had failed to produce. The change was so subtle that only the most observant members of the crowd would have noticed, but it was there nonetheless. Blake noticed the reaction immediately and pressed his advantage. "Oh, did I hit a nerve?" he taunted, his voice sharp with victory. "Finally got a response from our living statue. Maybe next time you'll remember to dress properly before you come out to play soldier." His fellow cadets laughed appreciatively, their mockery reaching new heights as they sensed victory within reach. The tourists leaned in closer, their cameras zooming in on Ward's glove where the mysterious strip of dark green fabric remained partially visible. Some began speculating among themselves about what it might represent, though most seemed content to simply enjoy the drama unfolding before them. A few looked uncomfortable with the increasingly personal nature of Blake's attack, but none stepped forward to intervene. Blake reached toward the rope barrier, emboldened by what he saw as definitive proof of the guards' lack of discipline. "This is exactly what I've been saying about these parade props," he continued, his confidence growing with each word. "Can't even maintain proper uniform standards while doing the easiest job in the military." The fabric had become the centerpiece of his assault, the physical evidence he needed to prove his point about ceremonial guards. The dark green strip caught the afternoon light as Ward shifted almost imperceptibly, its frayed edges telling a story that none of the mocking cadets could begin to understand. Blake thought he'd found the perfect insult. He couldn't have been more wrong. What Blake didn't realize was that across the courtyard, a figure in a higher-ranking uniform had been watching the entire confrontation unfold with growing concern. The weathered face of the approaching officer was grave as he observed the scene, his experienced eyes focusing not on the harassment itself, but on that small strip of dark green fabric that had captured everyone's attention. Lieutenant General Charles Redford stepped forward with quiet authority, his weathered face carrying the unmistakable weight of decades in uniform. His measured approach commanded immediate attention from everyone in the courtyard, though he moved past the cadets without so much as a glance in their direction. The general's focus remained entirely on Ward as he approached the rope barrier, with deliberate steps that suggested this was no casual intervention. Blake's confident smirk faltered as he noticed the approaching officer, though he didn't immediately grasp the significance of the general's interest in their entertainment. The other cadets exchanged glances, their earlier bravado wavering as they sensed a shift in the atmosphere around them. Something about Redford's demeanor suggested this wasn't a curious passerby drawn by the commotion, but someone with a specific purpose that had nothing to do with their game of humiliation. The crowd's laughter died instantly as Redford reached the rope barrier, his presence transforming the entire dynamic of what had been unfolding. Tourists lowered their phones slightly, sensing they were about to witness something far more significant than the mockery that had preceded it. The general's uniform spoke of service spanning multiple conflicts, lending gravity to his every movement as he positioned himself directly in front of Ward's post. "Corporal," Redford said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in earshot fall completely silent. "Where did you come by that marking?" The question hung in the air with unmistakable weight, though the tone suggested this was not harassment but an official inquiry that carried significance far beyond anything the cadets had been doing. The general's eyes never left Ward's face as he waited for an answer, and the intensity of his focus made it clear that this conversation would determine something crucial. Ward's eyes shifted slightly, the first break in his rigid discipline since taking his post. His voice, when it finally came, was steady and controlled as he spoke for the first time since the harassment had begun. "Unit 9, Romeo Echo, sir," he said clearly, the words carrying weight that only Redford seemed to understand. "Terran Count Attachment, 2008. The response sounded like a code to the listening crowd, but the general's reaction made it clear that Ward had just provided information of significant importance. Redford nodded slowly, recognition dawning in his weathered features as he processed Ward's answer. The general's expression shifted from inquiry to understanding, then to something that looked remarkably like respect. The tourists continued to record, though they had no idea they were documenting a moment that would reveal truths about military service that most civilians never witness. The courtyard remained frozen in anticipation as everyone waited to understand what had just transpired between these two soldiers. Blake remained silent, his earlier confidence evaporating as Redford's reaction suggested that the fabric beneath Ward's glove represented something far more significant than a uniform violation. The German cadet whispered something to his companion, his previous disdain replaced by uncertainty, as he began to sense that their target was not what he had appeared to be. The general's recognition of Ward's coded response indicated a shared knowledge that existed outside the ceremonial world these cadets thought they understood. The French cadet shifted uncomfortably as the weight of the moment settled over the gathered crowd. What had started as entertainment at the expense of a ceremonial guard was clearly transforming into something none of them had anticipated. Redford's eyes remained fixed on Ward's face as understanding passed between them. Two soldiers who had served in shadows that most people would never know existed. The general's next words would shatter every assumption the cadets had made about the man they had spent the afternoon tormenting. What happened next would reveal that the strip of dark green fabric represented a world of military service that operated far beyond the ceremonial duties these young officers thought they understood. Redford's voice cut through the courtyard silence like a blade, each word carrying the weight of classified knowledge that most people would never be cleared to hear. "Unit 9, Romeo Echo," he began, his tone shifting from inquiry to explanation as he addressed the crowd that had gathered to witness what they thought was simple harassment. "Attached to supply route operations through Taran Khaut, Afghanistan, a roughly 4-kilometer stretch of mountain road where NATO convoys move supplies between forward operating bases. Most of you have never heard of it because it was never supposed to exist in the first place." The general's weathered hands clasped behind his back as he continued, his eyes still focused on Ward's motionless form. "The patch under that glove represents something called Corridor Bravo, one of the most dangerous routes in the entire theater of operations. On paper, it was routine logistics. In reality, it was a killing ground where insurgents had weeks to prepare ambushes and plant explosives." Blake's confident expression began to waver as he realized the general was describing actual combat operations, not ceremonial duties or parade ground exercises. Redford turned slightly to address the cadets directly, his voice carrying decades of command authority. "Corridor Bravo required advanced teams to clear the route before convoys could move through safely. These teams went in first, always first, working under blackout conditions in territory where failure meant not just personal death, but international incidents. They did gray area tasks that left no public trace, missions that needed to be deniable if things went wrong. The German cadet shifted uncomfortably, his earlier mockery replaced by growing unease as he began to understand the implications of what Redford was revealing. The general's words painted a picture of warfare conducted in shadows, where success was measured not in medals or recognition, but in missions that left no official trace. Unit 9. Romeo Echo specialized in operations that couldn't appear in after-action reports, Redford continued, his voice dropping to ensure only those nearby could hear the classified details he was sharing. They went places where regular forces couldn't go and solved problems that officially never existed. Blake's face had gone pale as he realized the man he had called a parade prop had been part of operations requiring skills far beyond anything he had experienced in his training. Redford explained how soldiers like Ward were chosen specifically because they could handle missions that needed to be forgotten immediately after completion. These men were selected for psychological resilience as much as tactical ability, the general said, his respect for Ward evident in every word. They had to be capable of making decisions under extreme pressure, then living with those decisions in complete silence for the rest of their lives. The French cadet stepped back from the rope barrier, his theatrical gestures from earlier seeming childish and inappropriate in light of what they were learning. The German cadet leaned toward his companion and whispered urgently, "I thought Corridor Bravo was just rumors, stories the instructors told to make training seem more serious." His voice carried a tremor of realization as he understood they were witnessing confirmation of operations that existed only in hushed conversations between senior officers. Redford heard the comment and nodded grimly, acknowledging that most people in their position would have dismissed such stories as military legend rather than documented fact. The general's description continued to transform Ward from ceremonial guard into something approaching legend. Their service was deliberately erased from official records, Redford explained, his voice carrying the weight of institutional knowledge that spanned decades of classified operations. No commendations, no public recognition, no acknowledgement that they had ever been anywhere other than training exercises and routine deployments. The tourists continued recording, though they had no idea they were documenting revelations about military operations that most governments would never officially acknowledge. Blake stood frozen as the full implications of Redford's words settled over him like a heavy blanket. The toy soldier he had been mocking for hours was actually a veteran of operations so classified that their very existence remained compartmentalized information. Ward had participated in missions where failure meant not just personal death, but potential international incidents that could destabilize entire regions. The ceremonial guard they had been harassing possessed combat experience that made their own military training look like children playing war games. But Redford's expression suggested he wasn't finished with his revelations. The general's weathered face grew even more solemn as he prepared to share something that would transform their understanding completely. "September 15th, 2008, Redford began, his voice carrying the weight of classified knowledge. 7 soldiers from Unit 9 Romeo Echo were sent to secure a compound outside Torrent before a supply convoy moved through the next morning. Intelligence said the building was abandoned, but intelligence was wrong." The general paused, his eyes focusing on something beyond the present moment as he recalled details from classified reports that most people would never see. What they found instead were 40 insurgents who had been using the compound as a staging area for weeks, turning every room into a potential kill zone and every doorway into a death trap. Ward's team was outnumbered 6-1 before they even understood what they had walked into. Blake shifted uncomfortably as he began to comprehend the mathematics of survival that Ward had faced, his earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of impossible odds. Redford continued his account with the precision of someone who had studied every detail of the operation multiple times. The enemy had planned for exactly this scenario, sealing off escape routes and forcing Ward's unit into the center of the compound where they could be eliminated systematically. What should have been a 30-minute reconnaissance turned into a 31-hour siege with no air support, no extraction team, and ammunition that was running out faster than time itself. The German cadet's face had gone ashen as he realized the ceremonial guard had survived a situation that would have killed most soldiers within the first few hours. As Redford described the beginning of the siege, his voice carried the respect reserved for those who had faced the impossible and somehow endured. The building started collapsing around them 6 hours into the fight as insurgent rockets weakened the structural supports. Ward watched his teammates fall one by one as debris rained down, and enemy fire never stopped until he became the last man standing in a war zone that was literally crumbling beneath his feet. The French cadet stepped back from the rope barrier, his theatrical mockery from earlier seeming obscene in light of what they were learning. Redford's next words painted a picture of heroism that transcended military training and entered the realm of pure human courage. Ward carried his team leader to safety through concentrated enemy fire, dragging him 80 yards across open ground while bullets shattered concrete around them both. But instead of staying in safety, Ward made the decision to go back into that collapsing death trap. Blake's hands trembled slightly as he realized the man he had called a parade prop had displayed courage that most people couldn't even imagine, let alone demonstrate under pressure. The general described how Ward's first return trip was for the radio equipment they needed to call in an airstrike. The insurgents knew what Ward was doing and concentrated their fire on the doorway he had to use, turning each rescue attempt into a suicide run that somehow didn't end in suicide. Training and instinct became the only things keeping anyone alive. The tourists continued recording, though they now understood they were documenting something far more significant than entertainment. Ward went back a third time for a wounded interpreter, Redford continued, his voice carrying genuine reverence. He made that last trip into the building knowing it might be a one-way journey, but he went anyway because leaving fallen soldiers behind wasn't an option his conscience could accept. The roof collapsed 20 minutes after he emerged with the last survivor, sealing the compound that had become both battlefield and tomb. The general's words hung in the air as everyone present began to understand the magnitude of what Ward had endured. Only 2 soldiers walked away from that compound, carrying wounds both visible and invisible that would mark them for the rest of their lives. The patch beneath Ward's glove wasn't decoration or violation of uniform standards, but a memorial to 5 men who never made it home. But as Redford's expression grew even more grave, it became clear that the physical battle was only part of Ward's story. Redford's expression grew even more solemn as he prepared to reveal the most devastating aspect of Ward's story, the truth that would explain why the ceremonial guard carried his burden in complete silence. That patch was issued in the back of a supply truck 6 hours before deployment, the general said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of institutional knowledge that spanned decades of classified operations. No ceremony, no formal presentation, just 5 names hastily written on fabric that was never supposed to survive the mission it represented. The general explained how Unit 9 Romeo Echo was dissolved quietly after the torrent operation, its very existence scrubbed from official records as if 7 soldiers had never been deployed to Afghanistan at all. The unit was dissolved so quietly that most of the paperwork was destroyed before it could be filed, Redford continued, his weathered features reflecting the bureaucratic brutality that followed military disasters. Ward and his surviving teammate were reassigned to different bases on different continents before they could even process what had happened to them. Ward had spent the years since Terran Kaut carrying the memory of his fallen comrades in complete silence, unable to speak their names publicly or acknowledge their sacrifice in any official capacity. The families of the dead soldiers were told their loved ones had died in training accidents or equipment failures, their actual heroism buried under layers of classification that would never be lifted. Redford's voice carried genuine anger as he described this institutional betrayal, denying families the truth about how their sons and husbands had died. The patch beneath Ward's glove represented far more than his own survival. though that would have been burden enough for any man to carry. It was a promise he had made to remember soldiers whose names could never appear on memorial walls, whose sacrifice would never be acknowledged in official histories of the Afghan conflict. Ward carries a small list with 5 handwritten names and his own name circled, Redford explained to the stunned crowd, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding what that meant. Some uniforms carry stories that never get told. Some carry ghosts that never get properly buried. The tourists watched in stunned silence as they began to comprehend the magnitude of what Ward had been carrying alone all these years, standing guard not just over a palace, but over memories that were too classified to share and too important to forget. Blake realized with growing horror that every moment of his mockery had been an insult not just to Ward himself, but to the memory of 5 dead soldiers who could never defend themselves. The cadet's face had gone pale as he understood the true scope of his cruelty. Redford continued his explanation with the patience of someone who understood that civilian minds needed time to process the reality of classified military service. Ward requested ceremonial duty specifically because it allowed him to serve while processing trauma that officially doesn't exist, the general said, his respect for Ward evident in every word. He stands watch here not because it's easy duty, but because it's the only way he can honor his fallen teammates while continuing to serve his country. The general's revelation transformed Ward completely in the eyes of everyone present, shifting him from target of ridicule into guardian of memory who stood watch over stories too classified to tell but too important to forget. The ceremonial guard they had been mocking was actually carrying the weight of 5 dead soldiers whose families would never know the truth about their sacrifice, whose heroism would never be recorded in any official history. The German cadet stepped back from the rope barrier, his earlier theatrical gestures seeming obscene in light of what they had learned about the man they had been tormenting. The French cadet's confident mockery had been replaced by something approaching shame as he realized they had been face to face with a kind of heroism that transcended anything they had learned in their military academies. Blake stood frozen as the full weight of Ward's burden settled over the courtyard like a heavy blanket, transforming entertainment into education and mockery into profound respect for sacrifice that would never receive the recognition it deserved. The young officer's hands began to tremble as he struggled with what he had done and what he needed to do next. Blake stepped forward from the group of cadets, his hands visibly shaking as he approached the rope barrier that separated him from the man he had spent the afternoon tormenting. The confident officer who had led the mockery just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by someone struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what he had learned. His face had drained of all color as the weight of his actions settled over him like a crushing burden. And when he opened his mouth to speak, no words came out at first. "I didn't know," Blake finally managed, his voice cracking with emotion as he struggled to find language adequate for what he was feeling. The words seemed pathetically small in the face of Ward's quiet dignity, like trying to apologize for a hurricane by offering an umbrella. His earlier arrogance had been completely stripped away, leaving behind only raw shame and the terrible understanding that he had insulted not just Ward, but the memory of 5 dead soldiers who could never defend themselves. Blake's fellow cadets followed his lead, each stepping forward in turn to offer their own acknowledgement of what they had learned. The German cadet who had made theatrical salutes earlier now rendered a genuine one, his movements precise and respectful as he acknowledged what Ward represented. The French cadet stood with his head bowed, his earlier mockery replaced by the kind of silence that speaks louder than any words could manage. Redford watched the transformation with the satisfaction of someone who had delivered an important lesson about assumptions and respect. "There's a difference between ceremonial duty and ceremonial display," the general said, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent understanding what military service actually means. "Some people earn the right to stand in silence through actions that most of us couldn't imagine surviving, let alone performing with honor." The general's weathered hands moved with deliberate precision as he rendered a slow, formal salute to Ward, his movements carrying the weight of recognition between soldiers who had served in different wars but understood the same truths about sacrifice and duty. The salute wasn't required by any protocol or regulation, but it was earned through respect for what Ward represented and what he had endured in service to his country and his fallen comrades. Redford held the position longer than military courtesy demanded, his gesture communicating respect that no official paperwork could ever capture. Ward maintained his rigid position throughout the entire exchange, his duty unchanged by the revelation of his past or the complete transformation of his audience from mockers to admirers. The discipline that had kept him motionless during hours of harassment continued to hold him steady as apologies and respect washed over him like waves against a stone shore. His eyes remained fixed on their designated point, his rifle held at the precise angle that regulations demanded. The crowd began to disperse quietly, their phones disappearing into pockets as they realized they had witnessed something that transcended entertainment or social media content. Tourists who had gathered expecting to see either an embarrassing break in protocol or amusing defiance instead found themselves changed by understanding the weight that some uniforms carry. Conversations continued in hushed tones as people processed what they had learned about hidden sacrifice and classified service. The courtyard slowly returned to its normal rhythm of tourists, taking photos and guards maintaining their posts. But everyone who had been present during Redford's revelation carried away a different understanding of what they had witnessed. The ceremonial guards were no longer just colorful fixtures for tourist photographs, but guardians of stories too important to forget and too classified to tell publicly. Blake and his fellow cadets walked away in subdued silence. Their planned afternoon of entertainment transformed into an education about respect, sacrifice, and the assumptions that can blind people to heroism standing right in front of them. Their mockery had been replaced by profound understanding of how little they actually knew about the people they had been tormenting. Ward continued his watch as the afternoon sun cast longer shadows across the palace courtyard, still carrying his invisible burden of 5 fallen comrades whose names would never appear on public memorials. The day's revelations had changed nothing about his duty, but everything about how those who witnessed it would remember what they had seen. As evening approached and his shift neared its end, Ward remained as motionless as ever, guarding secrets that would follow him long after he left his post. The transformation of those who witnessed Ward's story would ripple far beyond that single afternoon. That evening, in the quiet of his modest quarters, Ward carefully unfolded a worn velvet pouch that contained his most precious possessions. Inside lay the original Unit 9 Romeo Echo patch, alongside a yellowed piece of paper bearing 5 handwritten names. 4 names had been crossed out with black ink, leaving only his own circled once in faded blue. This private ritual of remembrance happened every night, honoring sacrifice in ways that no parade or public ceremony ever could. Ward had requested ceremonial duty specifically because it allowed him to serve while carrying trauma and honoring the dead privately, standing guard over memories that required both silence and dedication. Some uniforms carry stories that cannot be told aloud, and sometimes silence is the way those stories are kept sacred. Did this story change how you view ceremonial guards? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden truths behind the uniforms we see every day.